We are proud members of the Spy Podcast Network. Find out more at www.spypodcasts.com.
Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised.
So for somebody like Musk, who really, really wants to go to Mars and who has repeatedly expressed contempt for, say, the Securities and Exchange Commission or Congress or individual politicians, they see all of that as just an obstacle. And so, to the extent that Putin is willing to take on the Western establishment and has nuclear weapons, we think, maybe, that gives this, this gold bug network an incredible amount of leverage to bring to bear on extracting changes and concessions that they may wish to pursue. And I think that's basically what's going on.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, I'm joined by Dave Troy, who's a researcher, technologist, and inventor who's interested in hybrid warfare and threats to democracy. And we discuss Dave's fantastic article about Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter titled, "No, Elon and Jack are not competitors, they're collaborating." And we take a look at the ideology that may be behind Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and how that aligns with other technologists and also Vladimir Putin, and how that could potentially be a threat to democracy and to the US dollar. I hope you find this episode interesting. Just before we begin, we now have a YouTube channel. I've been threatening it for a while, and now we have it. So please follow the link below in the show notes and subscribe to our YouTube channel. On there are video versions of the podcast, so if you like to see a squiggly line with your interviews, you can now see a squiggly line on YouTube. If you wish to support the podcast, there are a few options for you. You can become a Patreon subscriber and directly support the show for £3 a month. We also have a merchandise store at Redbubble. We have cups, coasters, water bottles, and tote bags, all available on the Redbubble store. Also, if you enjoy this episode, please share it on social media among friends, family, colleagues, cohorts. And lastly, please leave a review on your podcast app. All reviews help the show get discovered by other people. Apple Podcasts in particular love reviews, and they really help this show get featured on the app. So please do leave a review. All the links are available in the show notes below. Thank you so much for your support, and without further ado, let's get going.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Chris. Glad to be here.
It's great to have you on. So for the benefit of the audience, please could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am kind of a strange beast. I'm a technology entrepreneur who has, over the last 6 years or so, entered the world of journalism. I would say somewhat reluctantly. I did not really intend to do this, but basically what ended up happening was I was studying a lot of stuff having to do with social media data and community formation in social media. And so that led me directly into the world of disinformation and political warfare, which had me collaborating with a lot of journalists for several years, and kind of got to a point where some of the stuff that I was dealing with kind of needed to be told myself. Felt like the best way to do it was to kind of start doing some of my own writing. So that's kind of what's been happening over the last year or so.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating area to sort of be writing and researching about. So I think you're perfectly placed, especially with your background. That's brilliant.
Well, and I have, besides from my tech background, I'm also, went to school for history and liberal arts. So, I did a lot of historical research in school and found that a lot of the things that I was interested in have come back to be, extremely useful now in researching all this stuff. So being able to kind of do both data-driven analysis as well as historical, inquiry and primary source research and all of that kind of stuff has been a nice confluence of skills.
Excellent. Well, look, I wanted to have a chat with you today about your fascinating article that you wrote titled "No, Elon and Jack are not competitors, they're collaborating." And this was obviously in response to Elon Musk's successful purchase of Twitter.
Right.
So I suppose my first question is, what was your reaction to the news of Elon Musk successfully buying and taking over Twitter?
Well, so ironically enough, I was at the TED conference in Vancouver back in April when Elon Musk, it was the same day that it was announced that he was going to intend to purchase Twitter. And so I was sitting, maybe 20 feet away from that interview with Chris Anderson talking about, the intent to purchase and what his goals were and whatnot. And so I had a pretty good idea, I think, of what he was trying to do just from that one incident. And, that's discounting the fact that I've been kind of studying this network of people for several years. And so, there was all the back and forth with him, allegedly trying to get out of the deal and all the, sort of drama around that. And a lot of people were speculating that, oh, no, he didn't really want to buy it. And it was all just, foolishness and whatever. And I, having known these critters for a long time, I had a pretty good sense that this was not just some kind of lark, that they were in fact trying to, affect some fairly serious changes in global perception, if you will. So, when this finally went through, my first thought was kind of, well, I told you so. And then when he started making the kinds of changes that he was making and people were speculating about what that meant and whatnot, I just kind of had enough. I just was like, okay, I have to write something that tries to help people understand a little bit of the bigger picture here. And, obviously there's a certain amount of speculation about what that bigger picture might be, because you can't fully get into the heads of other people. But there is a lot of evidence that's factual that you can point to and say, well, why would they do these things if they did not have some bigger plan in mind? So that's kind of the reason why that I reacted in the way that I did with that piece. And then it, went crazy viral and whatnot. So
yeah, well, let's go into that piece, because there's some really fascinating things in there. So the first part of your article, a lot of people are obviously looking to leave Twitter and they've been sort of searching for other platforms. And Jack Dorsey, the co-founder of Twitter, has announced a new platform called Blue Sky.
Right.
And many have hoped that will be an alternative to Twitter. So what are your thoughts on Blue Sky and Jack Dorsey?
Well, I mean, I've known Jack since like 2007, and I met him at the Twitter headquarters back when it was a little tiny office on South Park in San Francisco, 2007. And, he's a really interesting and thoughtful guy, but he's also, kind of pie in the sky. He's sort of an idealist and has big ideas. And they're very, he's a designer kind of at heart. And that's kind of how he sees the world. And so, it's been well publicized that he didn't feel like that Twitter should have been turned into a company, as it were. He felt like it was something more like a protocol or a public good, and felt like that was the better way to kind of express the idea that he was trying to express with Twitter. And in the early days of Twitter, it was very much oriented around, the API and the idea that people could plug into it and build things. And that was how I came to it. I was actually the first external developer to use the Twitter API for something. I did a project called Twitter Vision that was a real-time visualization of tweets on a map, which was kind of a mashup of Twitter API and Google Maps API. And that was fun. That went really viral, and that was how I got to meet Jack and Ev and Biz and that crew. But as Twitter developed and, San Francisco venture capital scene being what it was at the time, they kept taking in more and more money in order to grow this thing, because it was, it sort of seemed like it was a thing, right? And even though it was very tiny, much tinier than people perhaps realized between, say, like 2007 and 2010, I was actually, for those 3 years or so, getting the entire fire hose of Twitter on a tiny PC, in a data center with a modest sized hard drive. And you were talking something on the order of, maybe several megabytes worth of traffic per day. It was not huge at all. And it sort of gained more notoriety than it actually had usage. So anyway, they kept throwing money at it. And at some point, I think it was around 2014, I have to go look up because somebody was saying 8 years the other day, was when it went public. And, that's sort of the beginning of the end for a lot of things because, instead of trying to meet some technical mission or, some user-oriented mission, you're suddenly oriented around shareholders. And I think that Jack found that very distasteful for his original vision. And, there was a lot of back and forth with him personally with the leadership of Twitter, where he was the CEO and then he was out and Dick Costolo was in for a while. And then he came back and then he was running Square and, trying to sort of fashion himself as a bit of a Steve Jobs character. And I think all of that was kind of, manufactured to some extent. I mean, he's not that guy. But at the end of the day, it got to a point where it was so huge and unwieldy, and he's got, how many employees were at Twitter? 7,500 or whatever. The thing seems like it's just gotten crazy out of hand. And so for whatever reasons, and, we'll get into all of that, he seems to have thrown in his lot with Elon to radically reorganize Twitter. And we, since I wrote that piece, I think I wrote that piece 2 weeks ago, we've seen more of what Elon's plans are in terms of laying employees off and reorganizing the company and all of that. So we know a little bit more about where it's heading, but they seem to be in lockstep, and they have been in communication over the last several days about, different things. And certainly Dorsey hasn't come out and said, I don't like what Elon's doing. The exact quote from Dorsey back in April was, "Elon is the singular solution I trust. I trust his mission to extend the light of consciousness," which gets into long-termism and whatnot, which is a whole nother crazy topic.
Well, yeah. So, in your piece, you argue that Musk's goals with Twitter are more ideological than financial, and that quote that you just mentioned there, "I trust Musk's mission to extend the light of consciousness," it seems a bit wacky and a bit out there, doesn't it? So I suppose, can you talk to us about Musk's potential ideological roots?
Yeah, so, he's an interesting character, obviously, in his own right. And, is a South African immigrant and went to school in the U.S. and whatnot. But, his grandfather was a guy named Joshua Haldeman, who was in Canada, Western Canada, in the 1930s and 40s. He was a chiropractor. And he was involved as a leader of something called the technocracy movement in Canada at that time. And it was kind of an emergent movement that started in the 1920s, I think, and possibly in the teens, but in the wake of World War I. In the United States, with the idea that industrial production would render scarcity a thing of the past. And so they sort of derived a whole bunch of implications from that, one of which was that, rather than having democracies per se, you should just sort of have technical managers and engineers that actually run society. And rather than using fiat currency or money, use what they called energy certificates as kind of an exchange of value. So basically saying, this certificate is the same as, 1,000 watts or joules or whatever the right measurement is for power, and, make that be the basis of this new economy. And it was heralded by some folks out of Columbia University, as well as the, famous economist Torstein Veblen. And so a lot of people kind of signed on to this as a kind of vision of the future. And so Haldeman was involved in that. Musk probably knew about that through family and through just reading and whatnot. But the thing that, he seems to have really latched onto is this philosophy called long-termism, which is also related to another idea called effective altruism. And this has been something that's been kind of bubbling along in internet rationalist message boards, places like lesswrong.com, which are populated mostly by young men, mostly engineers, who are trying to sort of reason their way through how the world works. And, so they come up with a lot of thought experiments about, what's the ethical thing to do in this? And it's sort of like dorm room philosophy combined with a kind of antisocial bent. And so just to be really blunt about it, a lot of what effective altruism and long-termism land on as solutions are ways to be selfish in the near term so as to achieve goals that you think are going to optimize for things that you want to achieve long term. So, for example, the idea of getting to be a multiplanetary species, which is something Musk is admittedly obsessed with, and the idea that charity in the short term on Earth, giving somebody a blanket or giving somebody money, in a developing country or something like that, might not actually be that effective because, it gets eaten up by the overhead of nonprofits and it goes to, funding warlords or, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of reasonable arguments for why standard models of charity are broken in pretty obvious ways. But they kind of take that to a logical extreme and start saying like, oh, well, rather than, fund these sorts of things, we should be doing these sorts of things, which will impact our future population of potential consciousnesses, which could include humans and artificial intelligence in 1 billion years in space. And it's like, whoa, that's a bridge too far. I always kind of laugh too, like, imagine if you were trying to get a girl to go out with you or something and, you're like, well, baby, the fate of 1,000 billion consciousnesses in the future in space depends on it. You wouldn't want to put that at risk, would you? I mean, it's like a ridiculous argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, that's basically the root of what we're talking about there.
How widespread is this belief as in the sort of technical community, if I put it that way, or the developer community? And is this something Jack Dorsey kind of buys into himself?
It's interesting. Like when I first met Jack, back in 2007, I feel like he was pretty liberal in orientation and pretty progressive. And over the years, he's gotten more and more oriented with like Bitcoin and whatnot. And Bitcoin is kind of right adjacent to a lot of these, libertarian, long-termist, effective altruist philosophies. And it's sort of also tied to, objectivism. So like Ayn Rand and, that whole set of philosophies. And it's a very kind of market fundamentalist view of the world. There's also another philosophy floating around near this called neo-reactionism, which is kind of a reactionary traditionalist philosophy. And then you have like the dark enlightenment, which is similar. And then you've probably heard of people talking about like the intellectual dark web, which is really talking about, popular writers and podcasters, sort of Joe Rogan, Sam Harris, Lex Friedman, Eric Weinstein, all people in that milieu. And so between all of these different, kind of related sets of ideas and networks, you have somebody like Dorsey who sort of seems to have gotten sucked into that vortex for whatever set of reasons. And I don't pretend to know now what they might be. One thing to think about, and, certainly your series kind of is touching on this world of intelligence, is that, somebody like Dorsey is influential, he's powerful, he's got money, he's influenceable because, he's a pretty open guy and, is open to hearing new ideas and stuff. So it's possible that he was sort of recruited into this to sort of help drive some of this kind of activity. And if you think about Twitter as being a kind of neural network, which Musk himself has said, it's sort of like a global consciousness or a brain, then you could actually use something like Twitter to kind of reprogram the consciousness of the world. And so it becomes an attractive target for capture, I think, by intelligence agencies and people with related agendas. And I think that's more or less kind of what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, and there's one interesting thing that you bring up. Well, many interesting things you bring up, but you mentioned the multipolar world, which is something that seems to be something Putin subscribes to. So there's some sort of convergence, and obviously you mentioned with the potential for misinformation and so on. Can you talk to us about how you think Musk might be interested in helping advance Putin's sort of idea of this multipolar world, and maybe explain what that is for us as well?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that Putin has been bringing up, very often over the last several years, but particularly most recently at the Valdai Discussion Club, he in a speech talking about, the multipolar world. And basically what that means is a world in which the United States is not the sole hegemon. And you've got influence from China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa. So it's particularly the BRICS countries, play heavily in Putin's vision there. And what they have been trying to do with that vision, and this is, documented going back at least 10 years, is to push back against the dollar as the reserve currency, to push back against central banks like the European Central Bank or the Japanese Central Bank, and to establish a global economic bloc within the BRICS countries, plus whoever else wants to join, to challenge the primacy of the dollar and do so based on currencies, perhaps metals-backed tokens, or whatever they're going to come up with, that are backed by like gold, copper, palladium metals. And this is something that's been well publicized by folks connected to the Kremlin. There's a Russian oligarch named Vladimir Potanin who has he runs this Norilsk nickel outfit that has been talking about doing metals-backed tokens, and the Kremlin has put some top people into that. So, that seems to be kind of what they intend to do. And so where this intersects is you have to go back and look at the history of the gold bug movement, really, in the United States and in Britain as well. You've got people like William Rees-Mogg and Jacob Rees-Mogg who have subscribed to this in the UK. And basically it's, the idea that when the US and, other countries went off of the gold standard, particularly in 1933, but then later in 1971, it created this kind of longstanding rift and resentment over currency. And, the idea is that all of this, fiat currency that's created by central banks is really play money, and it's not real. And it very much ties into a lot of the narratives that were first popularized, or at least most recently, popularized in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a Russian text, basically arguing that, there's a big giant, conspiracy by a cabal to control all the world's money. And so what these folks, like the PayPal outfit, the PayPal mafia group, so that would be Musk and Thiel and their close associates, and Putin have in common cause is that they both believe that's true. They both believe that there's this cabal that needs to be overthrown and to be replaced with this like hard currency. Now, there's probably asterisks on that and details may vary, but overall they're aligned because they both believe that these things are fundamentally unhelpful. And so for somebody like Musk, who really, really wants to go to Mars and who has repeatedly expressed contempt for, say, the Securities and Exchange Commission or Congress or individual politicians, they see all of that as just an obstacle. And so, to the extent that Putin is willing to take on the Western establishment and has nuclear weapons, we think, maybe, that gives this, this gold bug network an incredible amount of leverage to bring to bear on extracting changes and concessions that they may wish to pursue. And I think that's basically what's going on.
Yeah, and so they want to use Twitter as a tool then for information warfare to basically sort of kill off the dollar, is that right? And help push in sort of Putin's sort of multipolar world, is that right?
Yeah, I think that's generally kind of what's going on. Think about who's invested into this. You've got the Saudis, you've got the Qataris, you've got several of these kind of libertarian right-wing businessmen that Musk has recruited. We don't really know the full investor list on the Twitter deal yet. But, Musk and Dorsey, certainly are big Bitcoin fanatics and literally think that Bitcoin is going to replace the dollar. And Dorsey has, within just the last year or two, tweeted stuff like, hyperinflation is coming. Dude, no, hyperinflation is when currencies, devalue by like 1,000% in a couple months. We don't have that. We have high inflation, 10-14%. That's not great. But, it's not hyperinflation. So there's a lot of ideology that these guys seem to have baked in. And so the way I see the Twitter thing going right now is either A, and possibly both of these things are true, either A, he is seeking to kind of use it to conduct direct information warfare and to reshape kind of the consciousness of a lot of people. And, so look at what he's doing with the blue check marks. So he's going to take away the blue check marks from all of the sort of mainstream legacy journalists who have, earned those by way of being important in the old world, let's say, and replace that with people who are paying $8. So there's a kind of a inversion of who's important in that, and also a kind of weird egalitarianism that you could sort of argue comes from that, which, it's sort of complicated. And then, so, that could have a certain set of effects. The other thing, though, that he's doing is by radically restructuring the company and removing a lot of people and kind of tearing it apart limb by limb, he's effectively, starting to destroy the company. And I would argue that the surge of popularity of things like Mastodon and other kinds of decentralized ideas also kind of serve the agenda that he has, because effectively their argument that both Dorsey and Musk have is that this big centralized thing is ill-suited to the world that we want to be in. That, it's not fit for purpose in some ways. And so, and then that plays into this blue sky strategy of, creating a protocol versus a company, so it's a very kind of long range vision. And you could make an argument that like blowing up Twitter and decentralizing it through force could be seen as a kind of precursor to blowing up, say, the Federal Reserve and decentralizing it by force. And, the way that these kinds of operations tend to work is, there's usually kind of a series of like staged events. And I mean staged in terms of stage, literal stages, not something that's staged or made up. So if you think about Brexit as a precursor to Trump, let's say, which Bannon said, was explicitly his strategy, then I could see decentralizing Twitter as a precursor to decentralizing the Fed. And that's speculation on my part, but I think that fits. And again, some people are like, do you think they're really that smart to have this kind of like detailed plan? And my usual reaction is no, I don't know that they're that smart to have a detailed plan, but I do know what direction they want to go in, and I know what their desire long term is, and how they get there and the specific moves they make on whatever day, who knows. But it's like being out in the woods or something and being able to follow the North Star. As long as you've got a consistent direction, you're going to keep moving in a certain way, which gives some predictability to what we observe from them.
How likely do you think it is that Musk and his friends can kind of pull off what you've outlined?
Well, so I think honestly that there's a lot of miscalculation in this network. So, remember, Putin thought his war in Ukraine was going to last like 4 days or 7 days, and that, Kiev would fall and, Zelensky would be out and they would take over and it's going to be great. That didn't happen. We're on day 280 or whatever of that war. And so that's dragging on. And, Russia is being crushed under the pressure of that. Likewise, in the United States, there was a thought that there would be a red wave of some kind on the elections, and November 8th. That did not occur. And in fact, the performance of the Democrats was the best for a midterm, since JFK. So I think that they have misread the stars a bit with this. And, they thought that their moment had finally arrived. And the reason I think that they've misread the stars is because, all of these right-wingers have kind of put themselves into an isolating information environment where they're kind of listening to their own messaging. And they have convinced themselves of the correctness of their logic, and they have eliminated signals that might give them pause in terms of moving forward on this stuff. So then they've kind of all gotten themselves into this mode where they think, okay, well, this is the year. This is the year that it's going to happen, and we have everything on our side, and we have to go for it. And so they're very much, like a team that's out on the field trying to execute a set of plays that they just simply aren't equipped to execute on and to actually succeed with. And so I think that, we will see a certain amount of falling short of this strategy. But it's kind of like, the analogy I use is with January 6th, where that was a really dumb idea and very unlikely to succeed. But the very fact that they tried it caused an immeasurable amount of damage to the United States, to its reputation in the world, to our self-image, to just the sanity of the republic. And we've also had to go back and do all the hearings to adjudicate all of that. So I'm not so concerned about that they would succeed. I'm concerned about the damage that they could cause in the process of trying.
Yeah. Well, as you've just touched on, I mean, as we've seen with an influx of disinformation and hate content online, it has real-world consequences such as January the 6th, mass shootings and hate crimes. It could be argued that Musk's purchase of Twitter is a national security risk. Are governments paying attention to this? And obviously not just Musk, but other technologists around the world who've got similar ideas.
I think that they certainly should be if they're not. I would have to think that it's at least being looked at. Somebody at a press conference last week asked President Biden if Elon Musk represented a national security risk, and Biden's answer, which was very measured and considered, he said something like, well, I think that might be something that would be worthy of being looked at. And so I have the feeling that he knew more about that than he was saying. But I think if there was nothing to it, I think he would have just said, I'm not aware of any risks along those lines. So, I do think that people are looking at this. The thing that I should also say is that back in, like 2020, I started to get signals that Musk was going to be a problem because we were poking around in the bowels of a bunch of different, information operations and seeing who was involved and whatnot. And, I'll tell you just a little anecdote. I was leasing a Volkswagen e-Golf for 3 years between 2017 and 2020, and it was coming up for lease renewal or, expiration. And I kind of was looking at a Tesla, and I thought, well, it's a nice car. It's got twice the specs of the e-Golf, and it's a pretty reasonable payment and all that. And so, I put in an order for the Tesla in something like, July of 2020. And sometime in August, I started to get information that indicated that Elon was a problem, and with information that went back as far as like 2016, 2017. And I said to myself, you probably should not put the order in on the Tesla, because in a couple of years, you're going to find out that he's a huge problem, and you're going to have this Tesla and you're going to go, why did I do this? And so I have this Tesla and I'm going, why did I do this? I should have listened to my instincts. But I say all that just to kind of suggest that, we had information on this that looked like it was going to be a problem. And the thing about working in kind of the research space, sort of on the layer underneath journalism, is that you get information that, is of questionable veracity and value and all this kind of stuff. And so you're always creating weights about whether something is real or not. And the weight that I had on that at the time was something like, 30-40%, but it was still enough to cause me to ask that question. And then, the way that we kind of were testing to see whether that was a thing or not was to watch the behavior of people like Musk and Dorsey over the course of the last 2 years. And what we found was that at every available opportunity, it just kept getting worse, And so I was on to the idea that Musk was going to be a huge problem by like February of 2021. And, and then the suspicions just kept compounding and compounding. And now we see these big moves coming out, and it's all but confirmed. So I think, some people kind of think, oh, well, I'm just sort of extrapolating and, how do we know? And it's like, well, we know because we've been watching this for several years, and this is what we were guessing might happen as a worst case scenario. And now we're living it,
Yeah.
So.
May I ask, what kind of information operations were you looking into? Because I'm sure some audience members would be kind of like, when you mentioned that, be like, oh, what was that about?
Yeah. So, broadly speaking, into QAnon, but, really some of the adjacent characters to that, trying to understand some of the communications that was going back and forth. So there was a lot of stuff connected to like WikiLeaks and Vault 7, to the Seth Rich thing, to Julian Assange, to Russia. So that milieu of things. And, when in that mix, you start seeing like, oh, Elon says and Elon does, and, and then people amplifying Elon in certain ways at certain times with certain kinds of messaging, and it's all aligned. You develop this picture of like, well, it seems like it could be a problem. So that's kind of where we were prodding.
Yeah. Did it... sorry, you just got me into an interesting mindset because of what we've been talking about with a lot of technology people and these beliefs. I've always been fascinated by the motivations of Edward Snowden and obviously Julian Assange, and you've just mentioned Assange. I don't know if there's any kind of crossover with some of the things that we've talked about that with those characters as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's, fraught terrain, obviously, and I think that we just don't have enough information to really say for sure what was going on there. But, if you want to develop, like a worst case scenario picture, the worst case is that those guys were part of something intended to upend Western hegemony from the start. And there's some weird coincidences, like Snowden got information from a computer network that was overseen by the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is where Flynn was at that time. There's some possibility that, he had information from people connected to Flynn to extract specific information through a specific channel, all of that. The fact that, Snowden is now living in Russia and a Russian citizen and promoting Bitcoin and basically echoing everything that's coming out of Musk suggests to me that there's more to this.
Yeah.
Again, we don't know, but that's my guess. Now, and, with regards to Assange, I have the feeling with him, and this is just my opinion, I have the feeling with him that he may have started out in some kind of legitimate mode of wanting to do something honorable or to disrupt or what have you. And I think one has to ask, well, who is he to appoint himself to such a role? But anyway, I think by 2010, when you get the, rape allegations and whatnot, and I actually met Julian Assange at the TED Global Conference in Oxford back in like 2010, about 3 months before the rape allegations. And so it's possible that was a situation where he was, honeypotted or otherwise compromised and had some leverage brought over him, which may have started to influence how he responded to things. But, by 2016, he's pushing the fake Seth Rich story for Russia. And so at some point, he's clearly also in the bag for what amounts to the GRU. So I hope someday in the history books, maybe I'll even be involved in helping to dig up some of that history when the time comes.
Yeah.
But I hope someday we know the truth about all that, because it is really weird, and it certainly points to a more coordinated operation than perhaps has been previously known.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you for that. One other thing that jumped out at me just in the last few days with this sort of Musk's obsession, I call it obsession, but his sort of mission to put a man on Mars or a person on Mars, and his long-termism, as you've called it. Trump announced that he was going to run for president again, and one of his campaign pledges was to put a person on Mars. I wondered if there was any kind of crossover with Musk and Trump.
Yeah, that's another one of those weird signals that you get, and you kind of make note of it. And I think that is notable. It's also worth noting that Musk and the other PayPalers have been rallying around Ron DeSantis quite a bit over the last several months. So starting around June or so, I think Musk and David Sachs were both talking about how DeSantis was so great. There may be a certain amount of plan A and plan B going on here. I mean, like, nobody really knows what's going to happen with Trump. I personally think he's kind of toast and is likely to be indicted for something before he can, actually run for president. But DeSantis, I think, fits the mold of kind of like what this younger generation is hoping to, have to drive their agenda forward. And so, I don't know whether, the putting the flag on Mars thing is some kind of dog whistle for Musk or what have you. But, definitely it's something that, he's obsessed with, and sees this whole conflict as being centered around achieving that within his lifetime, which, he's basically my age. So he's 51, I'm 50, about to be 51. That's aggressive. You're talking about doing that in the next 25 years, realistically, max, because, he wants to be a 75-year-old on Mars. So.
Yeah, true. Well, one other thing as well with Musk, he was also, it was back in, I think it was it October? He was his Starlink. Musk has allegedly been providing Starlink to the Ukrainians. And there's some dispute about how much he has provided Starlink for free.
Right.
But he then threatened to turn the access to Starlink off in Ukraine, and then started trying to kind of come up with a peace plan that basically where the Ukrainians should sort of bow down to Putin. That was very interesting. I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, he and David Sachs and Jeffrey Sachs, who has been working with David Sachs, that's SACKS in the case of David and SACHS in the case of Jeffrey, he's an economist. And Musk have all been kind of pushing, for resolution. Now, this was all the while Medvedev and the other Russian leadership were saber rattling around nuclear weapons and everything. That seems to have subsided just a little bit while the whole Twitter fiasco has been going on. I feel like that they wanted to take some time to kind of let that do its thing, and also deal with the elections and whatnot. But I have a feeling that messaging is going to start coming back. And with respect to Starlink, I mean, this is one of those things where I feel like that, Musk has positioned himself in a lot of ways as a kind of a broker between parties. And by having that capability to provide, the battlefield intelligence stuff to Ukraine and to be able to turn it off at a moment's notice, that puts him in a position of leverage with both sides, really. And how that came to be, exactly, I think is kind of anybody's guess to some extent. But it's also worth looking at the history of SpaceX and how SpaceX came about. A lot of people don't know this, but the entire private space industry was made possible by enabling legislation that occurred in the late 1990s. So there was a bill that was sponsored, two bills that were sponsored by California Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, who is both a whack job libertarian, ideologue, and very close with Putin. And that really is what made SpaceX possible. And Rohrabacher and Musk, friends and whatnot, and had a lot of photo ops together and would go to each other's birthday parties and stuff like that. So, I think that is rooted in the desire to privatize the space system. And, not for no reason either. I mean, if you look at what NASA was doing for launches back in the late 90s, they had projects that were going to cost something like 35 to $40 billion. And private industry, in the form of SpaceX and whatnot, was able to accomplish the same thing for like 4. So you're talking like a 10x improvement in overall, capital efficiency. And so, it's not crazy to want to privatize aspects of the space program. But when you think about kind of like how that in practice needed to be done, there needed to be a guy to do it. There needed to be some mechanism, some company that was going to be, one of the major ones to take this on. They also benefited tremendously from tech transfer from NASA and things like that. So, to some extent, that makes Musk a kind of a made man, in that, he's kind of like selected by this libertarian enterprise to like extract this thing that had been kind of a cancer in government and turn it into this libertarian, privately owned good. And, that's not totally insane. Like, I get it. It kind of makes sense. But, taken to its logical extreme where, okay, now we're going to do the same thing again and again and again with like all of government and privatize it and dismantle government. At what point does that become, something highly anti-democratic and bad? And, because I don't know that the same pattern, the same template that worked for NASA in the late 90s works for like every other government agency, which is, I think, kind of where they're ideologically wanted to go. So just, big picture view there.
Yeah, well, no, thank you very much for that. Well, look, Dave, thank you so much for your time today. Is there anything else you would like to sort of talk about that's important to you that we haven't covered today?
Well, one thing that I think is kind of interesting to look at, and this is something that I'm researching and writing about right now, is this idea of the noosphere. And it's spelled noosphere, literally means knowledge sphere or mind sphere. And this was an idea that was first put forth by really 3 men, a guy named Vladimir Vernadsky, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Catholic Jesuit priest, and a Frenchman named Edouard Leroy. And they pioneered this concept. They met together in Paris in 1922 because they were all kind of thinking about this idea. And the idea of it was that the Earth was kind of going through some phases. The first phase being the geosphere, which is the raw Earth with like rock and water and chemicals and stuff on it. The second phase is the biosphere, which is the living Earth with plants and animals and whatnot on it, humans. And then the third phase would be noosphere. And the idea of that is that the consciousness that is made possible by humans, and I suppose other intelligences, would all sort of link together into one Earth-wide consciousness that would be global in nature. And when that transition occurred, it would be a kind of evolutionary step. It would be clear marker that the Earth had shifted into another form. And so what ended up happening with this idea was that Vernadsky popularized it in Russia and Ukraine in particular, because he was Ukrainian and went back and forth between Russia and Ukraine. And Teilhard de Chardin, or Teilhard as most people call him, his ideas became very influential in the United States and in Europe in particular. And so this would have been like around 1955 to 1965 was when Teilhard's ideas really started taking hold. So what this set up was kind of like the New Age movement, really, because it implied this evolution towards higher consciousness and to ascension. And so it ends up merging to some extent with ideas from theosophy and some of these Eastern religions, and kind of gets this big syncretic mess. So anyway, the reason that this is important is because that set of philosophies, Russian cosmism is really what this is called, at roots. So like Vernadsky was a Russian cosmist, and he borrowed ideas from another guy named Fyodorov. And Fyodorov, who lived prior to Vernadsky, around the turn of the century, theorized that it is the responsibility of the living to resurrect the dead. And the problem with resurrecting the dead, if you were successful at this, is you have a storage problem, because where are you going to put them all? So therefore, there is a mandate to colonize space and, to extend the light of consciousness, if you will, out into space. So for whatever set of reasons, this long-termist philosophy that Musk landed on by way of the channels through which he reached it, is very, very, very similar to Russian cosmism and to this concept of the noosphere and its roots. Putin, in turn, has stated multiple times that the noosphere concept is his model, his policy model for sustainable development. He has also stated publicly many times that the country that can dominate in the field of artificial intelligence will rule the world. He has also stated many times that love is the basis of his policies. Now, I think the Ukrainians would beg to differ, but love is a core concept of this noosphere idea, and is very much articulated by folks like Teilhard and Vernadsky. This brings us to the overlap with the New Age movement, and why stuff like QAnon actually does have a significant resonance in the New Age world, is because it's positing this kind of New Age eschatological consciousness and a shift to higher thinking. All of that kind of stuff is baked in. And lastly, in 2016, Putin appointed as his chief of staff a guy named Anton Vaino, who claims to have invented a nooscope, which is a device that he claims to have developed that can actually measure the transition to the noosphere and towards what Teilhard described as the omega point. So there's a lot of whacked out woo in here, and of course, anybody familiar with intelligence circles knows that woo and intelligence world go together like hand in glove.
Yeah.
So I think that that's sort of, again, the direction in which Putin is heading with this is like, he sees this noosphere concept, as he has glommed onto it and kind of co-opted it, as being an alternative vision to what he sees as a kind of straitjacketing that has resulted from Westphalian sovereignty and that sort of thing. So this is an alternative view of how the world could be, a multipolar world, if you will. So I think that's kind of the big picture.
Yeah, and I've seen that. Certainly, you mentioned the crossover, the New Age movement, and conspiracy theories. I mean, you see people like Alex Jones, David Icke.
Yep.
There's obviously QAnon people, and then there's a lot of people who are into sort of yoga and the anti-vax movement during kind of COVID and stuff. That's sort of starting to kind of all kind of converge together and become these sort of strange bedfellows.
Yep.
And it's connecting like the far right with the far left.
Well, and look at how like Dugan describes the war as being a conflict between Eurasia and Atlantis, and Shambhala and all of this. So Shambhala being the mythical, land of Eurasianism where, enlightenment is found. I mean, all of that ties into the yoga stuff. And so that gets you into Agni Yoga, Nicholas Roerich, and all of that strain of Russian thought. And so what I would just argue is that Putin's a little bit like a cafeteria Catholic, where he is basically selecting any kind of philosophies that can help to create linkages into the Russian population so that they will kind of buy into this. So that includes the noosphere concept. It includes Eurasianism. It includes the Russian Orthodox Church. It includes ideas about, say, Stalinist Russia. It includes ideas about Imperial Russia and Catherine the Great and the Romanovs and all of that. So, and I think some of that comes from Dugin. I think others of it is just kind of tapping into the folklore of the Russian state and Russian history. So it's all of the above, and for whatever reason, it seems like Musk and his PayPal friends are also on board with this so as to upend central banks.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Any thoughts on how, I suppose, listeners or us as individuals can kind of steel ourselves for this sort of situation and maybe try and sort of stop it in our own way, I suppose?
Gaining an accurate awareness of what's going on or what could be going on is important. And again, we don't know this with 100% certainty, but, evidence keeps stacking up. Let's put it that way, and has been for a few years now. So the thing that has me concerned right now is that the United States is, on track to need to raise its debt ceiling in January. And this is a self-imposed limit on our national debt that we have placed in order to just provide some sense of fiscal discipline or whatever. And that's fine, except that we need to raise it, because otherwise we're not going to pay our bills and we're going to default on our debt, and that's going to create a lowering of the U.S. credit rating, which is going to in turn affect the dollar, which is going to spark a massive global financial crisis. In general, U.S. politicians have never wanted to do this because it would be so damaging. However, the last time it was tried was in 2011 by Kevin McCarthy, who was the Speaker of the House at the time. And now it's 2023, or will be soon, and Kevin McCarthy is now the Speaker of the House, or very likely will be now that the Republicans have taken the House. And many Washington analysts are predicting that they are going to try to default on the debt, in exchange for concessions on Medicare and Social Security and this sort of thing. That is going to be a non-starter for Democrats, because Democrats won't compromise on those items, which means that also, possibly aid to Ukraine could be at risk. So, all of these things would be wins for Putin because they create craziness. And these are things that the libertarian far right are aligned with. And this aligns with what Musk and Dorsey and everybody else seem to want to do in terms of challenging the dollar. So I think we need to get realistic about that real fast. The lame duck period, the little tail end of Congress here that lasts through the end of calendar year 2022. They have an opportunity to potentially address this by eliminating the debt ceiling, and that could be useful. But if the worst case, let's paint the worst case scenario for January. The worst case scenario for January is that the debt ceiling is not raised. Let's say that Putin decides to do a demonstration of force with a nuclear weapon or an experimental weapon of some kind that puts everybody on edge. Let's say that Xi decides to start making moves against Taiwan, and you've got basically then a perfect storm. And let's say that Elon does something more insane with Twitter, just to add that to the mix. You've got a perfect storm of craziness going on. Let's say that because there's no more blue checks of trusted journalists, there's all these more impersonation and fraud and whatever else. And you saw the other day where just people playing around with like Eli Lilly accounts, they took off like 5% of their market cap, like $20 billion or something, just by way of a piece of misinformation. So we could have a very, very that's like looking at the worst case scenario. I think we could have a very toxic situation on our hands in January. Oh, and you combine that with all the chaos in the UK, both from a governmental as well as budgetary standpoint. You could have a major financial crisis being sparked both in the UK and in the US simultaneously that could lead to all sorts of ripple effects that people can't predict, which, if I were Putin, that would be what I would want to spark. So the key in my mind is making sure that can't be sparked.
Yeah, well, that helps Putin in a sense win the war in Ukraine, doesn't it? Because then we end up distracted trying to sort out our financial problems, and we're no longer able to give aid to Ukraine and so on. And
yeah. I mean, that's the key thing. Like, if the U.S. and UK and rest of Europe are no longer able, because of internal chaos, or let's say popular revolt because people are concerned about food and heat and things like that, we just won't be able to give aid to Ukraine, and then he can potentially make much more progress than he's made so far. I mean, arguably the only reason, not the only reason, but a major reason why Ukraine was able to retake Kherson was because of HIMARS and other Western weapon systems and support, intelligence support, things like that. Now, I guess we can continue to provide intelligence support, but if we can't provide weaponry, that's going to be a serious issue. So, that's to me what we need to be watching out for in 2023 is efforts that would advance plans to destabilize the dollar and to disrupt aid to Ukraine.
Well, I hope if anybody in the intelligence community is listening, I hope they're paying attention to that.
I hope so too. And all I can say is that I think that the intelligence community has been broadly aware of a lot of this stuff for like the last couple of years. But as always in government and in any institutions, you're dealing with factions, you're dealing with matters of the rule of law. And just because something is bad doesn't mean it's illegal or a chargeable offense. And so, there's a lot of waiting around until, the right moment comes to charge people with things. And sometimes that's too late. And I hope that we don't have that situation brewing. But I do think that people just being broadly aware of kind of like what's at stake here, what's in play, does help, because it helps to change the popular discourse from being like, oh, haha, look at Elon, look at how dumb he is, to being more like, actually, no, this poses a real serious risk. And I think that's a much more beneficial conversation to have.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are focused on the business side of it, thinking that he's just making poor business decisions. But
yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, I talk about this in the article some, the amount of money that they paid was a lot. They overpaid. It's kind of a dumb business. It doesn't seem like it's going to, pay off from a business perspective. But if your goal is to like upend the global economy and reshape the world order, then it doesn't matter what it costs. Also, if the deal is denominated in US dollars and you think that the US dollar is about to be worth a lot less, then it doesn't matter how many you pay, because they're worthless. Now, again, whether that's true or not is totally up to, we'll see how that goes. But, if you believed that, then it wouldn't matter what you paid for it. It's borrowed money. It's, not yours. The banks are already saying they're going to take a haircut. So, it really didn't matter what the price was.
Indeed. Well, Dave, thank you very much for your time today. Where can listeners find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, the easy thing to do is to check out Dave Troy. That's DAVETROY.com. I've got links to a bunch of different projects, including my own podcast, which is called Dave Troy Presents, as well as writing that I do at Washington Spectator. I've got a Medium blog. I've got a mailing list. I've got a Mastodon site that I set up for some folks to try out. So if you want to get onto Mastodon and check out the decentralized social media world, you can do that. That site is called toad.social.
Yeah. And can people still find you on Twitter?
Yeah, I'm at Dave Troy on Twitter too. Cool. I'll be there until they throw me off.
Yeah, me too. Well, thank you again for joining me today. It's been great.
Thank you, Chris. It was great to be here.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.